Welcome to Rock City Cookies, where we talk about all things cookies. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Thanks for watching. Hey sweet friends, welcome to the second member exclusive video in this Royal Icing series. Today we are going to talk all about making and coloring icing and bagging icing. So you will see how I bag my icing, why I bag it the way I do, and how I made all of these colors in this set. Now if you missed it, I will link the first video in this series up above or down in the description box below. And if you did not see that video, you definitely want to go check it out, because not only do I give you my royal icing recipe that I prefer and that I use, I also give lots of tips and techniques, and I explain why I do all the things that I do when it comes to making my royal icing. So definitely go check that out before you start this one. But let's go ahead and get started making this icing, and we're going to start with black today. As I mentioned in my how to make royal icing video, and I will also show you how I do this in the next video on freezing icing, I can't say never, I very rarely ever start my icing from white icing, because I freeze all of my leftover icing. So if I have any colors left over from a set, I put it in my freezer, I thaw it, and then I pull it back out to use again for the next set. So here you're seeing me use black from an old bag of icing that has been in my freezer. So the first thing that I do is I squeeze out that icing into a bowl. I then add fresh icing to that bowl to make sure that I'm continually freshening up the texture and freshening up the icing with new icing added to it. And then I add more coloring if I need coloring. The good news is when you do this, especially with your blacks, you're not having to add new food coloring. When you add just a tiny bit of fresh icing to it, it most of the time will stay black. If you do need to add a little bit more, you can by adding just a drop or two of more black gel food coloring into your icing. But I got lucky and my black was still very black, even though I added fresh white icing into it. Now I just did a whole lot of things that I didn't talk about, but don't worry, we are going to talk about every single one of these steps coming up. We have a whole lot of icing we're making in this video, so we are going to talk about all of these things in just a minute. I'm going to skip ahead to where we are now, and you see me tying this bag. Now this icing is my outline consistency icing. So this is my thicker icing. It's not super thick. It's like toothpaste consistency, but this is the icing that I prefer to outline all of my cookies with and to do detail work like writing on my cookies. So the way I know that this icing is that consistency is I tie the bag, and we'll talk about that over and over again, but keep that in mind. Tied bag means thicker icing. Now, because I'm reusing old icing, you're actually going to see me do most of these colors twice. And the reason for that is I'm taking my old thick icing and rebagging that, but I'm keeping that same consistency, that thick icing. This time you see me doing a second bag of black icing. Well, that was my thinner black icing, my flood consistency icing. So that is why you're seeing me do black a second time, because this black will be a totally different consistency than the first black that I did, because I make 2 bags of icing for every color I do. At least 2 bags. Every once in a while, I'll have to do a third bag if I'm doing a flower or something along those lines that needs really thick icing. You'll see me do a third bag. Or sometimes I need not quite a flood consistency, but also not quite a piping outline consistency. So sometimes I have to do an in-between there too. So I will do 3 bags if I know I for sure am going to need it, but most of the time you will see me do 2 bags of icing for every single color. So once I have the consistency how I want it, then I go ahead and do the same thing in an empty cup. I place my bag inside the cup. I then allow the cup to hold my piping bag while I scoop in my icing. I wanted to make sure to mention that I prefer to use Americolor Super Black. I used to use the Hobby Lobby black, and I would use so much black to try to get a good rich black color. I have found that Americolor black gives you a good black, deep black color without a ton of gel, which is important because when that gel can give an artificial taste in your icing. Some people even can taste some bitterness if you use too much of it, but also it can change the consistency of your icing. And black already has a different consistency than other icing gel colors. I don't know why, but my black icing is always just a tiny bit different than my other colors. And I think it is just because of what they have to use to get that deep, dark black color. But I definitely recommend AmeriColor Super Black because it does take a little bit less gel than other brands, and you get that good, rich, deep, dark black icing. And real quick, I tie off my thick icing bag so that I can look at that bag and know, oh, that is my icing, that is thick. And then for my flood consistency icing, I use a bag clip. So tied icing, thick icing. Bag clip is flood icing. So right away I can look at my bags and tell you exactly which consistency is which. All right, let's move on to the next color, which is going to be the complete opposite. And we're going to go to our tan color. So we went from a dark color to a light color. So again, I'm using icing that I had already used in a different set that was frozen and I had thawed, and I'm adding some fresh white icing to this color. So throughout all of this set, I'm always going to start with my thick icing first, my outline piping consistency icing. So that's what I'm doing here. So this is my thicker icing, and you can tell by me mixing in my new icing with the old icing, the consistency is perfect for outlining and for detail work. And this is exactly why when I stated in my how to make royal icing video that I mix my fresh icing to this consistency. This is why, because I can add it to old icing or I can have completely fresh icing at this consistency, and I don't have to thicken it or thin it. It can go straight into my bag after I've added the color to it exactly how it is. It's less work for me that way. So that is why I stated that in my last video, to make your mix of icing, your fresh icing, to make it this consistency, whatever this is for you, to make it to this consistency so that it's less work for you when you get to this stage in your coloring and bagging your icing. Now this is my thick outlining piping consistency. So what am I doing? I'm tying the bag so that I know, oh, this consistency is my thicker consistency. Now, while I'm finishing that up, I am going to talk to y'all about what you just saw me do, which was flinging the bag around. You've seen me do that several times now, so I want to explain what that is and why I'm doing it. That technique is actually called the helicopter technique. And what you do is you put all of your icing into your bag, but when that happens, your icing doesn't go all the way to the tip of your bag. Typically, it kind of stays wherever you were where you were scooping your icing into the bag. So by grabbing hold of the end of your bag and flinging it around like that, like a helicopter blade, it one, moves all of your icing to the tip of your bag, and two, the centrifugal force of you spinning the bag around also helps to move the air bubbles out to the end of your bag instead of the tip of your bag where you are piping. So it's extra important to do everything you can to help with air bubbles. And one of the ways that you can do that is to do this helicopter technique. So I use it every single time I bag icing. I typically do it over my head but I'm trying to get it here on camera. So it's typically over my head instead of in front of the camera. But I highly recommend doing this. I swing it around 10, 15 times, and that's it. I squeeze out the air bubble before I either tie my icing or clip my icing. There's typically an air bubble right at the end of the bag. I squeeze out that air bubble, and then I tie the bag or clip the bag, and then I'm ready to go. Now, this color of icing is going to be used on the gnome for this set. So I didn't want to add any more food coloring to this color because this light tan color is fine for a little yard gnome's face. So I was perfectly fine with just adding white to the existing tan icing and it even lightening it up even more, and then just bagging it from there. Now, how I made this icing was with ivory food coloring. So I actually prefer the Hobby Lobby brand because I have a Hobby Lobby close and it's super easy to go and grab. But AmeriColor has an ivory brand as well. So feel free to grab ivory, put a tiny bit of icing in there. In fact, you might just want to use a toothpick and dip your toothpick into your bottle of gel food coloring. Put that inside of your icing and mix that, and then add a little bit more if you need it with the toothpick instead of squeezing a drop drop into your icing because it can get too dark really quickly. So the toothpick technique helps a lot when you're trying to get a really light, faint, neutral color. So that's what I prefer is ivory for this. And again, tide icing, thick icing, bag clip icing, my flood consistency. All right, let's move on to the next color, which is an orange icing. Once again, I'm using some frozen icing that I've thawed, and I am placing it into my glass bowl. In between every single color, I do wash my bowl and I make sure I dry it really good before I put in the new icing that I'm going to be working with. The reason you need to make sure that your icing is dried really well before you put in new icing is because any moisture added into your icing is going to make it thinner. So I always start with my thick icing first. So I don't want to add any additional water into this icing because I want it to stay this thickness. So you definitely want to make sure after you've washed your bowl that you dry it really well before you put in your new icing. Trust me, I've learned this from lots and lots of experience of doing it the wrong way and by leaving behind water, and then my icing gets too thin. Now, my old icing that I used was a richer orange, and so by adding in the fresh white icing, it actually softened the orange a little bit and made it the color that I wanted it to be. So I got very, very lucky with this set, and a lot of the colors become exactly what I want them to be once I add in the white fresh icing. So therefore, this is another reason why I'm a huge, huge advocate for saving your leftover icing and freezing it for future sets, because I save so much money by doing this because I'm not having to buy food gel coloring near as often as I used to when I first started and I wasn't aware that you could freeze icing. I don't use all that much food gel coloring anymore because either my icing colors are great as they are coming from old sets that have been in my freezer, or if I do have to add additional food gel coloring to get it to the color that I desire it to be, I'm not having to add near as much because I already have a good base color, which is fantastic. And it really is a money saver and a time saver because I'm not having to go to the store to get more gel coloring all the time, nor am I having to ship gel coloring to my house and wait for that to arrive or plan ahead or be in panic mode because I don't have the right color. So it really does help, and I highly recommend freezing that icing. Again, I have a video all about how I freeze and what that looks like coming up soon, but I do want to really encourage you, if you're not freezing your icing, to do so. Now, this orange color was achieved by using Hobby Lobby's food gel coloring, which their brand is Sunny Side Up, and I used the terracotta orange and the copper, which is kind of an orangey yellow. So by combining the two, I kind of got this burnt orange color. And I believe that AmeriColor's color that is most similar to the terracotta is actually called burnt orange. So if you use AmeriColor, you might look at that color of food gel. And of course, I know there are a ton of other options for food gel colors out there, so don't feel like you have to only use Hobby Lobby or AmeriColor. There's lots of options for you out there. Okay, let's talk about this spray bottle that you see me using here to thin out my icing. This is a tip that I learned from Barefoot Baker when I first started making cookies, and I'm still using it 4 years later. Basically, you fill up a spray bottle that's designated for cookie use only. So don't use a spray bottle that you've used before. Buy a new spray bottle that you use for cookies only, and you fill it with water. Now, I prefer hot water. I mentioned this in my video, How to Make Royal Icing. I have found that if you use warm or hot water to do your icing, you actually, for me, it smooths out my icing so much faster than cold water. So I prefer to fill my water bottle with hot water. If for some reason it cools down, it's been a little while and my water's not hot anymore, I'll just dump it out and fill it back up with hot water again as I'm working on my colors. Now, some people just prefer to use a spoon and they spoon in water as they work, and that's perfectly fine. But for me, I love the control of the sprays. So I can actually count out the sprays. I do this without even thinking now. It's just muscle memory. I know, okay, about 30 sprays gets me to a flood consistency if I'm working from a thick consistency. Now, I know if I need just a little bit more, then I'll do 2 or 3 sprays or sometimes 5 sprays. So it's like I can look at an icing and kind of tell about how many sprays it's going to take because I've done this so many times. It just really becomes muscle memory, which is one of the reasons why I like it. I also also like that you can get a spray is a lot less than a spoonful of water. So you can get really specific amounts of water added to your icing at a time, and you're not overdoing it too quickly. And then your icing's too thin and you have to add powdered sugar and it's just a mess and it's way more work. So I love using a spray bottle. I will never go back. So if you don't use a spray bottle, if you've never heard of using a spray bottle, I definitely recommend giving it a try. All right, I scooped my icing into the bag. I did the helicopter technique and I put my bag clip on it because it is a flood icing. And I do cut off the excess bag after I've got either the bag tied or the bag clipped so that it doesn't get in my way as I'm working. Next up is our green icing. Now for this set, it was a St. Patrick's Day set, so lots and lots of green. So I'm actually doing 3 shades of the same green. So I'm going to start with the lightest shade of green first. So I'm going to take my old green icing, which was a very dark green icing. In Hobby Lobby colors, it was the forest green icing, and it was really dark. It was a very deep, rich, dark green icing. You'll see it again as I do the other greens. And in Americolor, the one that I found that's similar is called Cypress green. So either one of those greens will work. You just really need a really rich, deep green as your base to achieve these lighter versions of the green. If you're starting from fresh icing, you'll just want to put 1 drop at a time and mix in that color to see if it's the right color before you keep adding more food gel coloring. Now for the first time, you're seeing me actually flip-flop my icing proportions. So in all the other icing you've seen me do, I did a lot of my reused icing with just a little bit of fresh icing, and this time I did just a little bit of reused icing and a lot of fresh icing, which is actually very common if I don't have a lot of a color left or if I'm really trying to make a totally different color than what I already have. So this happens a lot. You definitely can reuse your old icing in a lot of different ways, and this is one of them. Now, this green icing had a little bit too much blue in it. So I decided I wanted to warm up the green and instead take away some of that cool tones. And to do so, I needed to add a yellow. So I added a yellow gel food coloring to this icing. It doesn't really matter what yellow you use, just as long as you use a yellow, then you're going to get more of a sagey green, which is what I was looking for here. I did not want too cool of a green for this set. So since I am using pretty much new icing, I'm not going to have a thick icing and a flood icing to make 2 different consistencies for. So when that happens, I actually make a larger bowl of icing to begin with. So I get my colors how I want them, which is what I was just doing. So I made that entire bowl in the outline consistency. I made that bowl into the color that I needed it to be. So I'm going to only scoop out a little bit of icing at first and put it into a bag for my outline consistency, and I'll tie that bag. And then what's left in the bowl, well, now I'm going to thin it down with my spray bottle into the flood consistency. Does that make sense? So I'm not doing double work. I'm not coloring my icing twice, hoping that I get it somewhat close to one another in a thick consistency and a flood consistency. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm just putting additional icing into my bowl to begin with. I get the color how I want it, and then I scoop out some of that icing so that I have outline and detail icing ready to go in that color. And then what's left in my bowl, well, then I'll add my water to it to thin it down so that now I have flood consistency in that color too, but I'm not doing 2 totally different bowls of icing. So this saves me a lot of time and a lot of frustration trying to color match 2 different consistencies. It's the same color, but I already have it right away in my thick icing and my flood icing. So how do you know when your flood icing is thin enough but not too thin? So here I am mixing the water in well, but as I do so, I will lift my spatula up and I will watch how it drips off of my spatula. If it drips not as fast as honey, but close to it. If it drips with a consistency where it runs off of my spoon, but it's not too fast, it's not too liquidy, I know it's ready. I also watch how quickly the icing incorporates back into the other icing. So as it's falling off of my spoon, I'm watching to see how fast it's dripping off, as well as how quickly the drippings of the icing mix back in with the icing in the bowl. If it mixes too quickly, then I know it's way too thin and it's going to run off my cookie. If it mixes after about 10 seconds or so, that's usually good for me. So about 10 to 15 seconds, if it mixes back in completely, that's the right consistency for my flood icing. If you accidentally get it too thin, add a spoonful of powdered sugar back into it, stir it really good, try to get out any clumps. If it's not thin enough, well then just add a few more sprays of water until you think it's the right consistency. All right, now that we have our thick consistency and our flood consistency for the light green, let's move on to the middle green, the mid green. So this time, once again, I'm going to be adding a lot of fresh white icing, and I'm going to be adding about double the reused green icing as I did the first time. So you're seeing it's quite a big clump this time because I want this green to be a richer green than the first green. So again, I'm trying to make gradients of the same shade. So I definitely need this one to be a little bit darker than the first. And thankfully, you have your bag of icing that you've already done that you can compare and pull that icing over to this new bowl and compare it and see if it's dark enough or not. So you do have a way to check yourself and see, I might need to add a little bit more dark icing to this, or dark food gel, or I need to add some more white icing if it's too dark. This is a rather large bowl of icing because I am going to be doing 2 consistencies out of this one bowl of icing. So right now we're getting the color right. Then we will scoop out some icing into a bag, which will become our outline and detail icing. And then whatever's left in the bowl, we will thin down for our flood icing. So that's why I have quite a significant amount of icing in this bowl. So the yellow food gel, I'm actually adding to all of these greens to warm them up and to take out a little bit of that blue undertone, is actually gold food gel. So you can use this. I think every food gel probably has a gold color. It's a very strong yellow color. So again, you can use any yellow. I just preferred this time. I attempted to use gold and it worked great for this set. So I added a few drops of the gold food gel until I got the right green tone that I was looking for. This is the most exhausting part, in my opinion, of doing icing. When you have a big bowl of icing like this, it takes a lot of stirring to fully incorporate the coloring into your icing, to incorporate water later on into your icing. It takes a lot of stirring. So you have to use your muscles on icing days. Unfortunately, sometimes my arm can get really sore depending on how many colors that I'm using. So just keep up the stirring until it's all mixed together. Now, I did just check to make sure that it was quite a bit darker from my original light green, and I'm happy with this result. Now, again, this consistency right here is my outline. It's my thick consistency. So I just put a couple of spoonfuls of icing into a bag. You really don't need a ton. I just kind of prefer to do a couple of spoonfuls, even though you could probably get away with just even one spoonful, one like larger spoonful of icing into your bag. Do the helicopter technique. Squish out those air bubbles that you might have at the end of your icing, and then tie off your bag so that you know, hey, this is my outline consistency just by looking at the bag. While I'm finishing up tying off this bag, and I will be going back and adding some water to the other icing in the bowl to thin it down for flood icing. I do want to mention the supplies that I use here. I prefer to use a glass bowl to mix my icing in, and that's mostly because I like the roundness of it. I can easily scrape off the icing from the bowl itself and reincorporate it back into the main icing. So for me, it's an easy way to mix my icing instead of having kind of a weird shape that sometimes the plastic containers come in. But also, this size bowl is enough for me to be able to do both consistencies. Remember, I do a big thing of icing sometimes in order to get my thick icing and my flood consistency all in one bowl. So I need a bigger size bowl, but I don't want it too big that it can't comfortably fit in my hand, because as you can see here, while I'm stirring the bowl, I actually keep it in my hand for stability and I move the icing around with my spatula. So it needs to be, for for me, for my comfort, I like a glass bowl that is large enough to hold the icing that I need. So I think this might be about 2 cups in size, maybe a little bit more, maybe about 3 cups in size. And then I keep the bowl small enough so that I can still comfortably hold it in my hand while I'm working with my icing. So that is my recommendation for what you use to mix your icing. I have this small spatula. I have 4 of them because I love them so much. I pretty much use them nonstop when it comes to mixing my icing. So these little spatulas, I'll see if I can find some similar and I'll link them in the description box below. They're like silicone spatulas, but I love, 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 love them. They're the perfect size and they scrape my bowl really well. As I'm getting closer to this being the right consistency for my flood, you see me stir slower and kind of fold the icing. As I'm doing that, I'm watching it to see how it's blending back together. I do, of course, lift my spatula up. I let the icing drip off of it, and then I see how those icing drips reincorporate back into the other icing to see how quickly it does it. So once I get a good runoff of my spatula, and I like for the icing to not blend immediately back into the other icing, but to blend back in anywhere between 10 and 20 seconds. If I have to shake my bowl a tiny bit to blend it back together, I'm okay with that because I can shake my cookie and it'll blend back together when I shake my cookie. So I'm fine with having to shake your icing just a tiny bit for it to blend smoothly back together, but I don't want it to just sit there and never blend back together. Really, if it takes more than 20 seconds, it's too thick. So that is my preference, and honest to goodness, the more you do it, the more you just get a feel for it. You just know it by seeing it, by the way it feels, by just how many times you've mixed. You just really start to get a great sense of your icing consistencies the more you do it. So practice, practice, practice. Before you put your icing bag clip on your bag, you definitely need to twist your icing very tightly many times around, because even though you have a bag clip on, if you do not have that icing twisted really tightly, then your icing can come out of the top of your bag. Your bag can get loose enough inside of that bag clip that your icing can shoot out the top while you're working, which you definitely do not want to have. And yes, that has happened to me, so I have learned this from experience. So make sure you twist quite a few times and you twist really tightly before you put that bag clip on, and then you can cut off your excess bag. Before we move on from the bag clips, I do want to mention that I get these from Truly Mad Plastics. You can use any bag clip at all. I just have gotten these from them because that's also where I get my piping bags from, and so it's just easy to order from them. However, I will say that you can definitely get bag clips from anywhere, but I have had these for 4 years and not a single one has ever broken. They are all still in phenomenal shape. So it is a great product and it's really inexpensive. I think I have at least 20 to 30 of them. So your initial investment might be just a little bit of money. I would say even if you don't want to fully invest, I would say at least get 2 packages of them so that you have 8 to begin with. But I use them on all of my flood consistency bags. And because I keep and save my leftover icing and put it in my freezer, which again we will talk about in the next video after this one, I need quite a few of them because it stays on the bag inside of my freezer. So I would say I have about 20 or 30, but you can have as many or as little as you want. But I do highly recommend the bag clips from Truly Mad Plastics because they have worked great for me for 4 years. All right, this is the last of the greens, and this is the darkest green. So I used a lot of my old icing, and then I only added just a tiny bit of new white icing to this bowl. And then I went ahead and added the gold food coloring in to, again, warm up our green. And as you can see here, I'm comparing all 3 greens, and I think that this is definitely dark enough. And so I'm going to go ahead and spoon in my thick icing and then thin down the rest of it for my flood. So this dark green versus the middle green is a great example of why I use old icing, because it is such a time saver. If you look at the middle green color that I did, that middle hue of it took me so long to mix that bowl of icing because it was mostly fresh icing with just a little bit of old icing. Whereas this time it was mostly reused icing with just a tiny bit of fresh icing. And if you go back and compare the times, this is me really doing this in real time. So nothing is sped up in this video. So you can see that using old icing from old old sets saves a tremendous amount of time than having to mix colors with new, fresh, white icing. It really does make a huge difference in your time. And when you're doing a lot of colors that already take time, even saving 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there, goodness gracious, it makes such a difference. So I hope that I am converting some of you and making you into believers to save that old icing, put it in your freezer. I will explain all of it in the next video on how I do it exactly. It's really simple, but definitely freeze your old icing if you aren't. Back to getting this icing down to flood consistency. I do want to also make sure that you understand not to put too much water in at a time. It's definitely best to gradually add your water into your icing to make the flood consistency, because one, if you have too much water in your bowl, when you start stirring, you can spill that water over the edge of the bowl and onto your counter. Trust me, I've done that too many times to count. So that is one reason why I go slow, but also to go slow, you're taking away some of the risk of getting your icing too thin too quickly. So by going slow, you are able to thin down your icing without having to worry about making a bigger mess and without having to worry about it getting too thin too quickly. And again, that's why I like the spray bottle, because you can really measure out those sprays in your head. You can be counting how many sprays you're doing to really help to not get it too thin. You also want to make sure the cup that you're using to put your piping bag into to spoon your icing into is a decently wide sized cup. You don't want the opening to be too thin where you can't put quite a bit of icing into it and put that icing in easily. So like we have some taller glass cups that are more on the narrow side, and I do not use those at all because it would be really hard to get enough icing into my bags without making a mess. And so I definitely recommend having a decent sized cup. This is actually a Bentley 20-ounce cup, which of course you can use whatever you want. We just are Bentley fans around here because they are wonderful cups that hold up to the test of time. You are more than welcome to use whatever you want, but this one is a 20-ounce cup. And like I said, it's significantly round across. I would say probably 4 inches across, maybe not, maybe 3, but it definitely has a wide enough opening and it's the same size all the way down the cup. So I'm able to put a full 20 ounces of icing in there easily if I would needed to. Okay, friends, we have made it to the very last icing in this set. I needed a thick white icing, so I actually didn't need any flood icing at all for this set. I just needed a thick white icing to use as the clouds on the rainbow in this set. Because of that, my icing straight out of the mixer is not thick enough to be able to do detail work like flowers, or in this case like clouds, where I really need the icing to keep its shape and not blend together at all. So because of that, I needed to add powdered sugar to this icing. And whenever I need to thicken icing, I add 1 to 2 spoonfuls of powdered sugar to my bowl of icing and I mix it really well. That mixing helps to get out any clumps of powdered sugar that you may have, because those clumps can clog up your piping bag, and so it makes it really difficult to pipe your icing out of it. And I've had some very frustrating experiences with some clogged bags. So definitely try to make sure to eliminate any clumps from your royal icing by mixing it very well. And it really depends on how much icing you have in your bowl with how much powdered sugar that you're going to need. So I usually start with 1 to 2 spoonfuls and then I add 1 spoonful at a time, and I see how thick it is after adding 1 spoonful before I add more. So you're just going to have to kind of play with it to see what consistency you need, but definitely go slow because you don't want it too thick or else you can't get it out of your piping bag or your hand is killing you whenever you use your bag. But do keep in mind, flowers are just going to take a whole lot more powdered sugar than just about anything else. And because I only needed that 1 consistency in white, we are done, friends. So that is how I made all of the icing I needed for this set. I hope this video was helpful and that you were able to learn some tips and tricks that maybe you didn't know before. Let me know if you have any questions at all. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.